What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? The question didn't come from a book or a preacher or a therapist, it came, oddly enough, from a flickering TV screen mounted high in the corner of a half-empty diner in Indiana. Frank Miller stirred his coffee absently, the spoon clinking lightly against the chipped ceramic mug as morning sunlight cut across the worn linoleum. A red-eyed waitress refilled his cup without asking. It was Thursday. It was always Thursday. Frank was 72 years old and had sat in this same booth for what felt like forever, 3 decades of retirement, a lifetime since the fire had gone out. Across from him was no one. It had been that way since Helen passed. He used to bring her here every Sunday after church. French toast for her. Black coffee and eggs for him. She'd smile, he'd pretend not to, and they'd split a slice of pie like teenagers. That was 20 years ago. Now he came here out of habit, not hunger. The same waitress. The same napkin dispenser. The same lonely hush that settled in once the breakfast rush died off. He could count the regulars by name and voice, Dale who read the sports section out loud, Mrs. Hendricks who always complained about the cold air blowing on her neck, and the teenagers who sat 2 booths over, scrolling their phones and pretending not to laugh too loudly. But today was different. Today, Frank heard something that pulled a thread inside him. Man, these old people, they just sit there like they're waiting to be collected, one of the teenagers muttered. Laughter followed. Not cruel, just casual, like they weren't even aware he could hear. Like he didn't count. Something about it hit harder than it should have. Maybe because it was true. Maybe because part of him was waiting. His hands tightened around the mug. A strange heat rose in his chest, not anger, not shame, something quieter. Emptier. Outside the window, a train howled past, kicking up leaves and dust like it had somewhere important to be. Frank stared at his reflection in the diner glass, stooped posture, graying eyebrows, liver spots on his hands, and wondered, when did he stop moving forward? The television on the wall cut through the silence with a jarring static crackle before locking onto a newscast. A stern-looking anchor sat before a digital backdrop of a rocket, all chrome and fire, the words, SpaceX, the Mars mission, scrolling along the bottom. Frank squinted. The image shifted to Elon Musk standing on a massive platform in Texas, wind rustling his jacket as he spoke to a crowd. We're launching the next phase of Starship development, Elon said, eyes alive, voice clear. It's not just about building rockets anymore, it's about building a future where everyone, no matter their age, can contribute. Some people want to watch history. Others want to make it. Even at 80, you still have a choice. Frank's heart stumbled. He set his mug down slowly, the clink echoing louder than it should. That voice, confident, unapologetic, focused on the future like it was something you could hold in your hands, jolted something in his brain that had been silent for years. Not because it was Elon Musk. Not because of Mars. But because of the way he said even at 80, you still have a choice. The diner blurred around him for a second. The waitress poured more coffee. The teens laughed again. But Frank wasn't there. He was 32 again, on the floor of Mission Control in Houston, slide rules and wireframe monitors glowing under dim lights. He was holding Helen's hand in the parking lot after pulling an all-nighter, rambling about reusable module concepts and high-efficiency propulsion. He was sketching dreamships on napkins. He was promising the world to a woman who already believed he'd give it to her. He blinked. The booth felt colder. The moment passed. But the feeling didn't. That quote rattled in his chest like a half-remembered melody. Even at 80, you still have a choice. It sounded like nonsense at first. Some tech billionaire stirring up attention. But it also felt like a challenge. A dare aimed straight at the part of him that had gone dormant. Frank finished his coffee. He pulled a 5 from his wallet, placed it under the salt shaker, and stood slower than he meant to. His knees complained. His hip ached. But he moved anyway. As he walked out of the diner, he didn't head toward his truck right away. He crossed the street, hands tucked in the pockets of his worn windbreaker, and kept walking. Past the hardware store. Past the faded war memorial with his father's name etched in stone. Past the old library now turned into a co-working cafe he'd never stepped inside. His feet stopped in front of the town's little museum, closed on Thursdays, but its window held a dusty model of a Saturn V rocket. It was one of his. Built in 1978. Donated after he retired. He stood there staring at it like it was someone else's life. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. The quote kept playing in his mind. Not the Mars part. The choice part. He shuffled into his garage around midnight, stepping over forgotten boxes and musty bins. He hadn't opened the workbench drawer in a decade. Inside, sketches, circuit boards, graphite pencils worn to stubs, and one perfectly preserved blueprint, his personal design for a modular water recycling unit intended for long-duration space travel. Rejected in 1991. He had fought for it. Helen had stayed up helping him tweak the diagrams. Someday, she'd said. But someday never came. Frank stood there for a long time, his fingers tracing the faded edges of the blueprint. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't even know if the idea would still hold up. But something in him whispered, do it anyway. He shuffled to his old laptop, blew off the dust, and waited as it booted up with a groan. The keys felt stiff under his fingers. The internet was slower than he remembered. But by 3 a.m., he had created a blog. He called it Rocket Grandpa. His first post was simple, I worked on spacecraft once. I gave up on my ideas. But I just watched Elon Musk say something that reminded me I'm not dead yet. So here goes. This is where I start again. He hit publish. No fanfare. No followers. Just pixels on a screen. But it was something. A tiny flare against the darkness. Frank went to bed without expectation. But the next morning, while refilling his coffee cup in the kitchen, his phone buzzed. He squinted at the notification. Someone had commented on his blog. Then another. Then 6 more. Are you the Frank Miller who worked on the Aquarius module design? One said. This is amazing. My granddad would have loved this. Another. Following for more. You're not too old, man. Keep going. He stared at the screen like it might disappear. Then he chuckled, a low, rusty sound that startled even him. Helen would have laughed. She would have said, told you. Later that day, the diner TV played another clip of Elon Musk, this time walking past a Starship prototype, hands tucked into his jacket, eyes skyward. Frank didn't hear what he said. He didn't need to. He'd already heard enough. Because something had shifted. A tectonic crack in the routine. A pressure valve released. For the first time in years, Frank Miller felt something closer to ignition. Like an engine warming up in his chest. Not for Mars. Not for glory. But for the simple act of trying again. He sipped his coffee, smiled at the waitress, and opened his notebook. The waitress blinked. New project? She asked. Frank looked up. Something like that, he said. Just figuring out how to launch again. She laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves. The train roared past again. But this time, Frank wasn't watching it go. He was climbing aboard. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next morning began the way most mornings did, slowly, quietly, with the creak of old joints and the aroma of burnt toast from a toaster older than the average Instagram user. Frank sat at the kitchen table, looking at the swirling steam rising from his coffee, but his mind wasn't in the room. It wasn't even in the present. It was somewhere between the scent of solder smoke and the low hum of a control room in 1975, somewhere between the steady rhythm of his drafting pencil and the sound of Helen humming in the other room while folding laundry. He hadn't thought this much in years. Not about the past. Not like this. Not with this strange combination of ache and possibility twisting in his chest like a coiled spring threatening to release. Last night's spark hadn't fizzled out. If anything, it had grown warmer, fuller, more real. The blog post was still live. 12 comments now. One from someone who claimed to be working at SpaceX as a junior propulsion tech, asking about the specs of Frank's old water filtration system. Frank reread it 3 times, certain it must be a joke. But it wasn't. The question was too specific. The tone was too respectful. He didn't reply yet. He needed to think. But thinking came easier in the garage. It always had. He shuffled toward the side door, keys jangling in his sweatshirt pocket. The autumn air slapped him awake as soon as he stepped outside, cool, crisp, that earthy smell of fallen leaves and distant fires. The garage door groaned as he forced it open, revealing a time capsule thick with dust and memory. The place was chaos in slow motion. Boxes stacked against the walls, cobwebs in corners, a fallen wrench near the tire of an old Schwinn bike Helen had refused to part with. He hadn't touched most of this in years. But the back wall still held his bench, his pegboard, his cabinets, the shrine of his mind's hands. He approached the largest cabinet, the bottom drawer sealed tight with rust and time. He gave it a good pull. Nothing. He tried again. Still stuck. He leaned his weight into it and felt the drawer give slightly, then all at once with a screech that echoed off the walls. Dust exploded from the opening like it had been waiting to breathe. Inside were the remains of a different life, binders of designs, folders of handwritten notes, thermal paper blueprints, yellowed schematics with creases as deep as crow's feet. And there it was. Near the back. In a sealed plastic sleeve. The blueprint. The one he hadn't looked at since the day he walked out of Johnson Space Center for the last time. It was labeled VLR-27, Closed-Loop Lunar Filtration Prototype. It had been his white whale. A water recycling system small enough to fit on a 2-man lunar rover but capable of converting greywater into clean, drinkable liquid with minimal power draw. Lightweight. Efficient. Rejected. Too expensive at the time. Too early. Too optimistic. Frank remembered pitching it to the board, his knees shaking, his voice steady, Helen sitting outside in the car with a brown bag lunch and a smile. He remembered the way the room had fallen quiet, not because they were impressed, but because they didn't want to say no to a man who clearly believed. Then someone asked the killer question, why reinvent something that works? And that was it. End of story. Budget cuts sealed the rest. The future, it seemed, didn't want what he had to offer. But now the future looked different. Now, the richest man on Earth was launching reusable rockets with carbon fiber hulls and talking about terraforming Mars. And that blueprint in Frank's hands suddenly didn't look like a relic. It looked like something left behind before its time. He laid it out on the bench, smoothed the edges, and stared. It was beautiful. A little naive, sure. Some calculations might be outdated. But the core idea was still solid. Still real. Still his. Frank's fingers moved on their own, tracing the same lines they had drawn decades ago, revisiting every valve, every sensor point, every redundant loop built into the design because he'd been obsessed with the idea of survival. That had always been the core of it. Not exploration. Not science fiction. Just survival. And that was the real irony. In trying to build something to help people survive on the moon, he had forgotten how to survive here. After Helen passed, he stopped building. He let time collect in corners. He let his identity fade. But now, Now he was remembering. That afternoon he dug deeper, pulling out old notebooks, running his hand along the dusty spine of a binder labeled alternate materials, personal use only. He found napkin sketches, photographs, a letter of recommendation from a supervisor long gone. He scanned what he could into his laptop, straining his eyes, adjusting for smudges, marveling at how different the world had become while the ideas in his hands still held weight. He posted another blog entry. This time with a photo of the blueprint spread across his workbench, captioned simply, "Time doesn't make bad ideas better. But sometimes it makes the world ready for them." A few hours later, the blog had been shared on a small Reddit engineering group. By evening, someone had reposted it to X, formerly Twitter, with the caption, "Meet Rocket Grandpa. Built this in the 80s. Could have helped on the moon. Might help on Mars." Frank had no idea what a retweet was. But he did know what it meant when the view counter hit 5,000. He wasn't trying to go viral. He wasn't trying to be noticed. He was just trying to feel alive. Still, that night he slept with a printed copy of the blueprint on the nightstand. He told himself it was just in case he wanted to look at it again in the morning. But the truth was simpler. It felt like company. The next morning, Carolyn called. His daughter's voice came through the phone with that familiar balance of exhaustion and love. "Dad," she said, "what's this blog thing I'm hearing about?" Frank chuckled softly. "Just something I've been messing with." She paused. "You're, on the internet?" "Looks like it. You okay?" "Surprisingly, yes." "You sure you're not going crazy? This doesn't sound like you." "Maybe it is me," he said, "just a version that forgot how to speak up." There was another pause. Then she said, "Well, I think it's cool." "Weird. But cool. Just don't forget to eat, okay?" Frank smiled. He hadn't heard her sound proud in years. Not like that. After hanging up, he sat in the garage again, the morning sun filtering through the window blinds like slats of golden energy cutting across the room. Everything looked sharper, clearer, more possible. The workshop didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It felt like a launch pad. That afternoon he went to the hardware store. Bought soldering wire. A new cutting mat. Some basic components. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Working on something?" "Yeah," Frank said, "something old. But also maybe, something new." The man didn't ask questions. Frank liked that. That night, Frank found a podcast interview with Elon Musk from years ago. He played it while tinkering. Elon was talking about failure, about how every engine that exploded, every module that crashed, taught them something new. "You only lose when you stop trying," he said. Frank paused the recording. He looked down at the workbench. At the notes. At the comments piling up on his blog. Maybe he'd stop trying. But not anymore. Even if it didn't lead to anything. Even if no one cared. Even if his hands were slower, his body stiffer, his eyesight weaker. The ideas were still sharp. The will was waking up. The blueprint drawer had been sealed for 20 years. Now it was open. And for the first time in a long time, so was Frank. Open to wonder. Open to purpose. Open to the idea that maybe his last chapter didn't have to be quiet. Maybe it could be the loudest one of all. The morning after the blog passed 10,000 views, Frank stood in the middle of his garage with a wrench in one hand and hesitation in the other. The space had changed, subtly but unmistakably. The dust was still there, the corners still cluttered, but something new had taken root, an energy, like the hum before launch. The light filtering through the small windows carried a different texture, as if it had noticed the blueprint spread across the bench and decided to treat the old man inside with more respect. Frank reached for a metal clamp and tightened it on a pipe he had repurposed from an old dehumidifier. His fingers fumbled. He dropped the screwdriver. It clattered loudly on the concrete. He sighed, bent down slowly, knees resisting, and picked it up again. You used to be faster, he muttered to himself. But he didn't stop. He didn't retreat. That in itself was a kind of progress. He looked over at the laptop resting on a nearby stool, the blog still open, a new comment blinking at the top. This one was from someone claiming to be an intern at JPL. Love your take on microgravity filtration. Would love to pick your brain if you're open. My email's below. Frank blinked at the message. He read it again. Pick your brain. He hadn't heard that phrase in years. Not since the days when younger engineers leaned over his desk with notepads and ideas, hungry for validation. It was flattering. And terrifying. He didn't feel like someone worth learning from anymore. Not lately. His thoughts drifted to Carolyn. She had always seen the world in practical terms. Efficient. Secure. After Helen died, she had quietly nudged Frank toward downsizing. Maybe a condo, somewhere with maintenance. But Frank couldn't imagine parting with the garage, not because of the tools, but because of the silence. Silence had become his closest companion. Predictable. Painless. Safe. And yet, ever since he posted that blueprint, silence had taken on a different tone. It no longer comforted him. It taunted him. It said, "This is the sound of the rest of your life unless you do something." He sat at the bench and ran a hand through his thinning hair. He remembered Elon Musk once saying, "Some people build tunnels. Some people build excuses." Frank had scoffed at the time, but now it rang truer than he wanted to admit. He had built excuses for 2 decades. Too old. Too late. Too forgotten. But the excuses were cracking under the pressure of attention. That afternoon he dialed a number he hadn't called in 15 years. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah. Ray. It's Frank Miller." A pause. Then, "Well, I'll be damned. Are you still alive or did I hallucinate this call?" Frank chuckled. "Still alive. Mostly. No kidding. Thought you went off the grid." "I kind of did." "Well, what's the occasion? Need a kidney?" "No," Frank said, still smiling. "I need a second opinion." Ray Guzman had been his closest friend at NASA. A mechanical genius with a gift for reducing the impossible into weekend projects. After retirement, Ray moved to Houston and started volunteering at the city's Science Museum, tinkering with youth programs and occasionally consulting on STEM exhibits. Frank filled him in on everything. The blog, the blueprint, the reactions online, even the JPL intern's message. When he finished, Ray was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You know this is nuts, right? You're 72. 73 next month. Even better. And what, now you want to get back into the game?" "No," Frank said. "I want to finish something I started." Another pause. Then Ray laughed. "Well damn, man. About time. I'm serious. So am I. You've been dead behind the eyes since Helen passed. If this is what brings you back, then hell yes. Come visit. Let's blow the dust off those brain cells." The next day, Frank bought a new spiral notebook, a packet of mechanical pencils, and a ticket to Houston. It was the first time he'd flown in 10 years. The airport overwhelmed him, the noise, the pace, the robotic boarding announcements, but something inside him stayed calm. Focused. Like muscle memory coming alive. On the flight he sketched adjustments to the filtration design, reworking old flaws, making room for newer materials. By the time they landed, he had filled 9 pages. Ray picked him up in an aging Prius that smelled like coffee and solder. "You look good," Ray said, squinting at him. "Thinner. But like, in a haunted librarian way. Thanks for that, Frank muttered. They drove straight to the museum. Ray led him through the back entrance, past the exhibit halls and into a small workshop that doubled as a robotics lab. It smelled like ozone and ambition. Kids in school uniforms tinkered with wires and code, barely looking up as Frank passed. Ray leaned in. They're building Mars rovers. Like real prototypes. Competing in a state competition. Impressive, Frank said. One of them's 12. Wrote her own AI code. Makes me feel like I peaked in '84. They laughed. Ray introduced him to the group and told them who Frank was. At first they stared blankly. Then one kid Googled him and whispered, "Oh crap, this guy's legit." Frank offered a shy wave. "Hi." He stayed for an hour. Then 2. Then 4. By the end of the day he was elbow-deep in a 3D printer repair and discussing closed-loop fluid dynamics with a boy named Malik who had a mechanical instinct that reminded Frank of himself at that age, curious, meticulous, hungry. One of the girls, Eliza, asked him, "Did you really work on Apollo stuff?" "Helped build a piece of it, yeah." "So you're like, old-school NASA." "That's one way to put it." "That's badass." Frank smiled. It wasn't the word he would have chosen. But it felt good. That night, Ray and Frank sat on the museum roof with beers in hand, the skyline of Houston stretching out in quiet neon. "You think it's too late?" Frank asked. "For what?" "To contribute. To build something that matters." Ray took a long sip. "You ever hear what Elon said about dying on Mars?" "No," he said, "I want to die on Mars. Just not on impact." Frank chuckled. "That guy's something else. He's a fire starter. And you've still got fuel. You just forgot how to light the match." Frank leaned back, staring up at the stars. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was looking at something far away. He felt like he was looking at something possible. The next morning, one of the kids at the museum asked Frank if he would mentor them on a propulsion project. Another wanted feedback on a new sensor array. The staff offered him a temporary advisory badge. Frank accepted without hesitation. He spent the next week in Houston. By day he worked with the students, answering questions, offering critiques, relaying old mission stories. By night he reworked his blueprint, adjusting flow models, considering 3D printing applications, reducing weight by 18%. Every day felt like oxygen. On the 7th day, he got a message on his blog from someone with a SpaceX email address. It was short. "Mr. Miller, would love to connect. We're exploring closed-loop water systems for potential lunar outposts and would appreciate your insights." Frank stared at the screen. A drop of sweat slid down his temple. This wasn't a joke. This was real. It was happening. He wasn't just waking up from a long sleep. He was being called back to the table. He responded, "I'd be happy to share what I know. Just let me know when." Then he sat back in his borrowed chair in the museum office, hands trembling. The garage echoed in his memory, the sound of silence broken by a single tool falling. The sound of his past tapping him on the shoulder. The sound of the future knocking. Frank sat in the borrowed office at the Science Museum, staring at the blinking cursor on his laptop screen like it was the eye of a storm. The email from SpaceX still sat open, marked "Re." Closed-loop system, waiting for his next move. It wasn't long, just a few lines, courteous and professional, but the signature carried weight, Principal Systems Engineer, Lunar Sustainability Division. He read it again, trying to process the surreal reality that someone, at the bleeding edge of space technology thought he had something worth hearing. His hands hovered over the keys, hesitant. What do you even say when a door like this opens in the last third of your life? He exhaled slowly and began to type. "Dear Ms. Howard, thank you for your message. I'd be glad to share what I've developed and discuss its potential application. I have the original designs, revised models, and am currently updating for contemporary materials. Please let me know what time works for a call or video chat. Best, Frank Miller. He read it once, then again, then clicked send. The moment the email disappeared from his screen, something clicked in his chest. A small release. Like lifting a foot from the brake after sitting too long at a red light. He closed the laptop and turned toward the window. Outside, students in matching t-shirts were unloading robot parts from plastic tubs and laughing about something he didn't catch. Ray stepped into the office holding 2 cups of coffee. Still on Earth? Just barely, Frank said, accepting the cup. They responded. Want to meet? So what's stopping you from jumping out of your socks? I don't know. Maybe the part of me that still thinks this can't be real. Ray sat down, leaning back in the creaky office chair like a man who'd already outlived 5 versions of himself. You ever see those old Apollo videos? When they'd show the guys walking on the moon for the first time. Everyone always talks about Neil, but it's Buzz you want to watch. He didn't hesitate. Didn't inch his way down the ladder. He jumped. So I'm supposed to jump? You're already in the air. Now you gotta land. That afternoon Frank went back to his hotel room and dug through his bag for the notebook. The pages were filled with sketches, diagrams, calculations scribbled out and rewritten again and again. He flipped to a clean page and started fresh. Not a blueprint this time, just words. A list. He titled it, Things I Want to Do Before the End. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was something Carolyn had said once, or maybe it was just the quiet tick of time getting louder in his ears. The first item he wrote down, share what I know with someone who can carry it forward. The second, apologize to Jacob. He paused. That name hadn't appeared on a page in decades. Jacob Miller, his son. His only son. They hadn't spoken in almost 14 years. Not since the funeral. It had started with silence and ended with anger. Frank had said something stupid, something about how grief made people selfish, and Jacob had snapped. Frank never called. Jacob never came back. Carolyn had tried to play peacemaker once or twice, but nothing stuck. The distance hardened. The ache buried itself. Frank stared at the name on the page for a long time. It felt heavier than it should. Then he flipped the notebook shut. Not now. But soon. That night, back at the museum, he stayed late in the workshop, alone under the hum of fluorescent lights. He was finalizing a revised model of the pump core when a voice called from behind him. Mr. Miller. It was Malik, the sharp kid with the steady hands and quiet intensity. Everyone's gone, Frank said, not looking up. What are you still doing here? I wanted to ask if I could show you something. Frank gestured toward the table. Go ahead. Malik pulled out his tablet and opened a 3D modeling app. I've been working on a small modular waste separator for low-gravity environments. It's rough, but, he tapped a few times, and a model spun on the screen, a surprisingly clean layout of interlocking chambers and dual flush valves. Frank leaned closer. You came up with this yourself? Well, I mean, sort of. I was reading about your closed-loop design and tried adapting it to something lighter. Portable. For one person. Frank smiled. You've got the spark. Malik shifted, uncertain. Yeah. You really think it's, like, good? I think you're 15 and already solving problems most grown engineers can't. Malik looked down, embarrassed and proud all at once. Can I help you with yours? Like, your design. Even just testing stuff or printing parts or whatever. You want to help me? Yeah. I mean. I think it's cool. What you're doing. Most people your age, he stopped, realizing the sentence might come off wrong. But Frank just laughed. Most people my age gave up. You can say it. I used to be one of them. Malik smiled. Well, you're not anymore. They spent the next 2 hours building a miniature test rig using parts from the student scrap bin. By midnight, they had a basic circulation loop running clear water through a half-sized model. It wasn't perfect. But it worked. When the last drip of water cycled through the loop without leaking, Malik looked up and grinned. It's working. Frank nodded slowly, watching the fluid churn through the transparent tubing. Yeah. It is. The following morning, the call came. SpaceX. A young woman named Elise Howard introduced herself over video chat, background blurred but voice crisp and confident. Mr. Miller, I just want to start by saying, your work is remarkable. We've reviewed the original design you posted, and frankly, some of it's decades ahead of its time. Frank cleared his throat. I appreciate that. I always believed it could work. Just never had the chance to prove it. Well, we're giving you the chance now. If you're open to it, we'd like to bring you on as a consulting contributor. Remote, part-time. No pressure. Just access to our materials team and a chance to collaborate on adapting your system for use on the Artemis Pathfinder outpost. Frank blinked. You're serious. Elise smiled. We don't joke about closed-loop systems. Not anymore. They talked for nearly an hour. She asked technical questions. He answered with clarity he hadn't known he still possessed. She mentioned Elon Musk in passing, saying, he saw your blog. He said, if this guy's still breathing, get him involved. Frank didn't know how to respond to that. After they ended the call, he sat in stunned silence. Then he did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He cried. Not from sorrow. Not from pain. From sheer disbelief. From the overwhelming sensation that something long dormant had reawakened. That afternoon he walked to a payphone near the old post office. He dialed a number he still knew by heart. 1 ring. 2. 3. Then a voice, hello. Jacob, Frank said. It's Dad. Silence. Frank could hear wind on the other end. A car driving by. The weight of years pressing between them. Then Jacob spoke. Wow. Didn't expect to hear from you. I know. I should have called. A long time ago. Yeah. You should have. Frank gripped the receiver tighter. I'm sorry. For everything. I wasn't there when you needed me. I thought I was protecting you by staying away, but really I was just protecting myself from feeling the guilt. Another long pause. Frank waited. Then Jacob said, softer, why now? Because I'm building something again. And I remembered what it felt like to matter. And I realized I don't want to matter if I don't matter to you. Frank expected anger. Accusation. But what came next was a quiet sigh. And then, I'm glad you called. The words cracked something open. Not a flood. Not a fix. But the start of something. Frank stood there in the fading afternoon light, the weight of 1,000 silent days lifted just enough to breathe again. Later that night, he returned to his hotel and opened his notebook. He crossed off 2 things, share what I know with someone who can carry it forward. Apologize to Jacob. Then he flipped to the next page and wrote just 3 words, it's not over. Frank's plane touched down just before dusk, the twilight turning the sky over Ohio into a pale watercolor of soft orange and blue, as if the universe was easing him gently back into reality. The runway lights blinked in a rhythm that reminded him of heartbeat monitors, steady and mechanical, a silent rhythm that felt oddly comforting now. He stepped off the plane with a different gait, still slow, still cautious, but steadier than before, as if his shoes had remembered they were built for motion. The airport was small, familiar. Nobody waiting for him. No signs, no balloons, no welcome committee. But that was okay. What he carried inside him now didn't need applause. What he carried now was purpose. In the back of the cab, he opened his notebook and reviewed the email from Elise one more time, the official documents confirming his consultancy status with SpaceX's lunar sustainability team. The contract wasn't flashy. Just 3 pages. Flexible terms. Modest pay. But the title was real. Contributor. That word meant something. It was a validation of every late night spent over his workbench, every moment of doubt, every year lost to silence and dust. It said, "You're back." The garage greeted him like an old friend as he stepped out of the cab and unlocked the side door. He flicked on the lights and inhaled deeply, the familiar scent of machine oil, cold metal, and old pine floorboards settling into his chest like a song he never stopped loving. The blueprint still lay on the workbench, but now surrounded by newer parts, updated components, sketches from Malik, and scribbled notes from Ray. It looked less like a relic now and more like a living document. Something breathing. Something becoming. He opened the laptop and joined the shared SpaceX workspace Elise had invited him to. His username, fmiller72, blipped into existence among others, engineers, designers, architects, dreamers. His icon was just a gray silhouette, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was there. In the room. At the table. He uploaded his revised schematics and added a brief annotation, improvements based on feedback loops in variable gravity tests. Still tweaking the flow regulation chamber. Open to notes. Within minutes, replies trickled in. Brilliant layout. Very clever use of passive separation. We're testing this on a 0G rig next week. Frank blinked. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. This wasn't just a nod of approval. This was real-time collaboration. For a moment he just sat there, listening to the faint hum of the garage's overhead light. Then he laughed, quietly at first, then louder, until the sound filled the space around him. Not manic. Not overwhelmed. Just joy, in its purest form. Joy that had nothing to do with youth or glory, but with being useful again. With being seen. The next morning he walked to the local diner for breakfast, the way he used to when Helen was still around. The staff had changed, mostly college kids now, but the cook was still the same, George, with his tattooed forearms and cigarette rasp. George blinked when he saw Frank walk in. Miller. You're not dead. Not yet. Coffee? Stronger the better. Frank sat at the counter, scanning the morning paper out of habit. Nothing in print could compare to the whirlwind of the last 2 weeks, but it grounded him to hold something real. George poured his cup. Heard something weird the other day. My nephew said some old guy posted a space design online and now he's working with SpaceX. That true? Frank smiled into his cup. Could be. Hell. About time someone noticed. You always had that mad scientist look. I'll take that as a compliment. You should. That afternoon, Frank returned to the garage and began preparing for his first virtual meeting with the SpaceX team. He cleared the workbench, repositioned the lighting, and even trimmed his eyebrows. There was something endearing about the whole process, like watching someone get ready for a date after decades of being alone. When the meeting started, Frank's face filled a third of the screen beside younger, sharper images, engineers in their 30s, 40s, all talking in acronyms and data points. But when Frank spoke, the room went quiet. He explained the core concept behind the closed-loop system, his logic for using modular passive channels over active pumps, and how lunar dust could clog traditional systems if not properly diverted. He didn't lecture. He told stories. Stories of early days in Houston, of failed tests, of learning from the silence of sensors and the smell of burnt circuitry. And when he was done, someone said, "That's the kind of thinking we need." Not just theory, experience. Another said, we should bring him into the habitat design thread. And just like that, Frank wasn't just a contributor. He was part of the crew. That night, Carolyn called. I read the article, she said. You're in Wired, Dad. I didn't know until someone emailed me. They called you, the unexpected comeback of aerospace. Catchy. It's incredible. She paused. I'm proud of you. Frank's voice softened. Thanks, sweetheart. Do you want me to come by this weekend? I can bring the boys. They've been asking about you. Frank's throat tightened. Yeah. That'd be nice. You cooking or should we bring something? I'll make chili. Like the old days. After they hung up, Frank stood in the middle of the kitchen, holding the phone, remembering the sound of Helen humming while chopping onions. He smiled, then turned back toward the garage. There was more work to do. The next few days were a blur. Virtual meetings, late-night tests, emails from college students asking for advice, even a podcast invitation from a popular science channel. Frank declined that one, at least for now. The attention was welcome, but it wasn't the goal. The goal was clear. Finish the system, contribute to the lunar habitat design, and pass the torch. And maybe, just maybe, leave behind something that would outlive him. On Friday, a package arrived from SpaceX. Inside was a black jacket embroidered with the company's logo and his name stitched on the sleeve, F. Miller, Consultant. He ran his fingers across the fabric, feeling every thread. He thought of Elon Musk again, not as a celebrity, but as a symbol. Not of wealth or fame, but of refusal. The refusal to accept limits. The refusal to slow down. The refusal to let others define what's possible. Frank wasn't chasing Mars. He wasn't building rockets. But he was building again. And that, in itself, was revolutionary. Later that night, he received a message from Malik. I told my mom I want to be like you when I grow up. Frank sat with that message for a long time. Then he replied, be better. Start younger. And never stop asking, what if? He shut the laptop and looked around the garage. The space had become more than a workshop. It was a launch pad. A classroom. A confessional. It was everything he thought he'd lost. And something more, proof that the story wasn't over. That night, before bed, Frank opened his notebook to a blank page and wrote a single line. Sometimes the return trajectory is the one that takes you furthest from where you started, and closest to who you are. Then he turned off the light, the blueprint still resting near his pillow, and let himself sleep, not as a man running from time, but as one racing back into it. Frank sat on the back porch with a mug of reheated coffee and a chill in the early morning air that cut straight through his old joints. He liked it that way. The cold made him feel alive, reminded him his blood still moved, that his lungs still expanded with something more than memory. His hands, gnarled with time, still gripped the cup like a mechanic with work to do. The garage light flickered from the motion sensor, though he hadn't walked inside yet. It was his signal now, the way he measured time. Days since his return to building. Weeks since the call from SpaceX. A month since he'd reached out to Jacob. And now, this Saturday. Carolyn and the boys were coming. For the first time in years, his house would be filled with voices. He was terrified. Not of the noise, but of what it meant, to be seen again not as someone quietly fading, but as a father, a grandfather, a man who had chosen to come back from the edges. He poured the last of the coffee down the sink and started pulling out ingredients for chili. The cutting board felt heavy with nostalgia. Onion. Garlic. Peppers. Helen used to prep it all with military precision, humming Motown tunes while she worked. She'd been gone a long time now, but sometimes, when the house was quiet enough, Frank could still hear the ghost of her voice, like static from a distant radio frequency he couldn't quite tune in. While the chili simmered, he walked out to the garage and sat at his bench, the schematic glowing on the screen like a second sun. The filtration system was 87% finalized. They were testing a variation of it in a sealed pressure environment next week. If the numbers held, it could be installed on a prototype module bound for lunar surface simulation in Nevada. Not exactly the moon, but the closest thing on Earth. Frank opened a new document labeled Addendum A, Lessons Learned. He began typing notes for the younger engineers. Stuff he wished he'd known when he was their age. Practical things. Like how to account for vibration stress when seals start aging in extreme environments. Or how to spot a microfracture in a polycarbonate tube just by the sound it makes when tapped. And less practical things. Like how not to mistake burnout for failure. Or how guilt can be rocket fuel if you let it burn clean. He paused after that last line. Let it sit there. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Jacob. Traffic light. 20 minutes out. Frank stared at the screen. 2 decades of silence collapsed into those 6 words. He pocketed the phone and paced. Looked at the clock. Adjusted a picture on the wall that had been crooked for 3 years. Looked at the clock again. He heard the car before he saw it. Tires on gravel. Doors opening. A young voice shouting, "Grandpa." Then the thud of feet on the front steps. And there they were. Carolyn, smiling like she didn't carry the weight of every conversation they'd never finished. 2 boys, Alex and Max, bigger than he remembered, taller than seemed fair. And Jacob. Taller too. Grayer around the temples. A stranger and a mirror. Frank froze. Jacob didn't. He stepped forward, and for one heart-stopping second, Frank thought he might turn around and leave. But instead, Jacob opened his arms. "Hi, Dad." It was the most ordinary thing in the world. And it broke Frank in half. They hugged. Awkward. Stiff. But real. Then Carolyn stepped in, laughing nervously. "We brought pie. Store-bought. Don't judge." "I'll pretend to be offended," Frank said, voice rough. Max asked if the chili was spicy. Alex wanted to see the garage. Frank found himself laughing as he gave them a tour, pointing out the old lathe, the drill press, the prototype on the bench. "What's that?" Max asked, poking at a valve. "That," Frank said, "might be going to the moon one day." "No way," Alex said. "Like for real?" "For real." They asked if he was an astronaut. Frank smiled. "Just an old engineer with some unfinished business." Jacob hung back, arms crossed, eyes moving slowly around the space. Frank could feel the tension, like static between 2 frequencies. Later, when the boys were outside tossing a football, Frank poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to his son. "We haven't done this in a long time," he said. "No," Jacob replied, "we haven't." A beat of silence passed. "I want to say something," Frank continued. "And I want to get it right. I wasn't the father you needed after your mom died. I didn't show up. I didn't know how. I was too busy looking backward. I lost her, and then I let that loss become everything. I shut you out thinking I was protecting us both." Jacob's jaw tightened. "You were angry. I was broken. And I took too long to admit it." Frank waited. Let the silence stretch. Then Jacob said, "I was angry too. Still am, some days. But also, I'm glad you're back. Whatever this is. I think she'd be proud." That last sentence landed like a capsule touching down after re-entry. A long, dangerous flight suddenly made safe by 4 words. She'd be proud. Frank nodded. His eyes glistened. Thanks. They sat on the porch and watched the boys run back and forth, chasing the dying sun. That night, after they left, Frank returned to the garage. The smell of chili lingered. The garage light buzzed above him, soft and familiar. He opened his laptop and uploaded a video message to the SpaceX team. "Testing looks promising," he said. "The system's holding pressure better than expected. But I've been thinking about failure modes, and I believe we need a tertiary bypass valve just in case the interior chamber pressure hits a spike during lunar ingress. I've mocked one up. Sending it now." He paused. Then added, "Also, I wanted to say thank you for pulling me back into the game. Most people think the past is what defines you. But I've learned lately, it's what you choose to do after the past that writes the next chapter." He ended the call. Saved the draft. Sat in the silence again. There were regrets, yes. There would always be. But now they didn't anchor him. They fueled him. And if there was rocket fuel in regret, then Frank was ready to burn clean. He closed the laptop. Looked around the space. Every tool had a place. Every line on the schematic pointed forward. Somewhere on the moon, someday soon, a valve might open. Water might flow. And his name, small, invisible, but present, would be part of it. He smiled. Then picked up his wrench and got back to work. Frank stood in the center of his garage staring at the prototype, hands on hips, sweat on his brow, and saw something most people wouldn't. Not tubes, valves, or synthetic membranes, but moonlight. He imagined that very module sitting in a sealed dome on the Sea of Tranquility someday, quietly circulating air and water for the next generation of explorers. He imagined a young technician tapping on its casing and seeing the faint lettering etched into the steel, F. Miller, Adaptive Closed-Loop Life Support Prototype. He didn't need to be on the moon to touch it. It was already in his garage. The dream had come home. His phone vibrated, and he wiped his hands on a rag before checking the screen. Malik. Coming by after class. Bringing a friend if that's okay. Frank grinned. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji, something he'd only recently learned how to use properly, and tossed the phone onto the bench. He walked over to the whiteboard where he'd drawn a crude diagram of the bypass valve, its 3 pathways marked A, B, and emergency. He'd added notes overnight, details about failure thresholds, sensor drift, and temperature offsets. The handwriting was jagged in places, rushed in others, but all of it was alive with purpose. The door opened 10 minutes later, and Malik stepped in, followed by a girl with wide eyes and a backpack full of something that clanked. "Mr. Miller, this is Naomi. She's working on fluid control systems for the school's Mars HAB challenge." Frank nodded. "Glad to meet you." Naomi stepped forward and extended a hand. "I read your original design 6 times. It makes so much sense now that I see it in person." "That's the thing about theory," Frank said, shaking her hand. "It floats. You don't know if it holds until you give it gravity." Malik chuckled and Naomi beamed. Frank motioned toward the prototype. "I've got a variable leak issue on the outflow. Just a trickle, but enough to spike pressure over time. You want to have a look?" Naomi's hands were already reaching for her toolkit before he'd finished the sentence. Malik pulled up the sensor readout on the laptop, and for the next hour, the 3 of them bent over the equipment like surgeons around an open heart, voices bouncing between calculations, suggestions, and the occasional curse when something didn't quite fit. Frank felt 30 years younger. Not because he moved like it, but because he mattered like it. He wasn't the wise old man handing down scrolls from the mountaintop, he was a collaborator, neck deep in the work, solving problems shoulder to shoulder with kids who would be there long after he was gone. When they finally fixed the leak with a temporary seal, Naomi high-fived Malik, and Frank couldn't help but laugh. "You know," he said, "you two remind me of a team I worked with at JSC back in the 80s. Just smarter." Malik grinned. Maybe just younger. No, I mean it. This stuff. It's not about age. It's about hunger. Curiosity. The willingness to try something that might not work and fix it until it does. Naomi looked around the garage, her gaze lingering on the aging tools, the battered stool, the taped-up wiring, the solder station that smelled faintly of burnt metal. You've built your own lab out here. Like, a space station in miniature. Frank raised an eyebrow. Never thought of it that way. It's like the moon, right? She said. You're isolated. You have limited resources. But you make it work. That's engineering. He stared at her a moment, and in that moment, Frank saw what Helen used to call the mirror moment, the split second when someone says something so true you don't just hear it, you recognize it. He turned back to the workbench, suddenly seeing everything differently. The overhead light wasn't just a bulb, it was a sun lamp. The concrete floor wasn't just a slab, it was lunar regolith. The silence wasn't just silence, it was space. This was the moon. And he was living on it. Malik tapped the screen. We're getting clean flow readings. I think it's stable now. Frank nodded. Good. Take the data. Compare it against the expected variance. If it holds, we'll call it version 2.0. Do we get to name it? Naomi asked. Frank smiled. Go ahead. She and Malik whispered for a moment, then turned back. We're calling it the Lazarus Loop. Frank blinked. Lazarus? Because it came back to life, she said. Like you. For a long second, Frank couldn't speak. Something caught in his throat. He coughed, then cleared it. Lazarus Loop. I like it. That night, after they left, he sat alone in the garage, the only sound the slow, rhythmic pulse of the recirculation test running in the background. He looked around and took it all in. The worn tools, the cables, the oil stains on the floor. Every square inch of this place had seen him fail. And now it was seeing him fly. The garage had become more than a workspace. It had become his station. His outpost. His proving ground. In his notebook, he scribbled another list. This one he titled, Unexpected Discoveries. 1. You're never too old to teach, or to learn. 2. Sometimes the comeback is better than the first act. 3. The moon isn't just up there. It's wherever you dare to build. The next day he joined a video call with the SpaceX materials team. Elise was there, along with a few new faces, thermal engineers, 2 biochemists, and someone from communications. Frank felt the old nerves creep in at first, but the moment he shared the sensor logs from the Lazarus Loop test, the tone shifted. These are tight, one of the engineers said. Your pressure curves clean as hell. Another asked about the emergency shutoff valve, and Frank explained the redundant seal bypass he and Naomi had added. You built this in your garage? One woman asked. With high schoolers? Sure did. This could beat our current mock-up. That's the idea, Frank replied. Elise smiled. You're giving our team real competition, Frank. Not competition, he said. Just collaboration from a different zip code. They laughed, and Frank felt something he hadn't expected, belonging. After the call, he received an email with a formal invite. SpaceX wanted him to present the Lazarus Loop at the upcoming Innovation Summit in Austin. It wasn't just engineers anymore. Investors. Policy makers. Dreamers. Elon might be there too. The email read, if you're comfortable presenting your work, we'd love to showcase the Lazarus Loop as a symbol of cross-generational engineering and resilience. Let us know. Frank read it 5 times. Then 10. The word that stuck wasn't summit or showcase. It was resilience. That night, he called Jacob. They want me to speak in Austin, he said. That's amazing. You think I should go? Dad, you came back from nothing. You built something that might save lives up there. If you're asking whether you're ready, hell yes, you're ready. Frank paused. Would you come? To Austin? Yeah. You and the boys. If I'm up there talking about resilience, I want the people who taught me how to be resilient in the audience. Jacob was quiet, and for a second, Frank worried he'd asked too much. But then his son said, "We'll be there. Front row." Frank ended the call and stared up at the rafters. He imagined Helen's voice drifting down from somewhere above. "Told you it wasn't over." He laughed out loud. Then he walked to the prototype, adjusted one last valve, and stood back. The moon, it turned out, wasn't 238,000 miles away. It was right here. In a garage. In a valve. In a second chance. The air inside the convention center in Austin felt thin, artificial, conditioned to the edge of sterility, and Frank couldn't decide if it was his nerves or the altitude of opportunity that made it hard to breathe. He'd arrived that morning, blazer packed in a garment bag, prototype tucked inside a reinforced case, heart pounding like a launch countdown. Malik and Naomi were already on site, wearing custom SpaceX lanyards and bouncing between booths like kids at a candy store. They'd spent the entire flight down arguing about whether lunar habitats should use underground lava tubes or surface domes. Frank had just smiled, listening to them speak in acronyms and optimism, as if failure didn't exist. The green room backstage was full of quiet energy, keynote speakers murmuring to themselves, engineers rehearsing slide transitions, interns darting between doors with walkie-talkies and caffeine. Frank sat on a folding chair, knees aching, hands folded, watching the digital timer on the wall tick down the minutes until his talk. 22. He'd given presentations before. Decades of them. But never one like this. Never one that carried the weight of time. This wasn't about specs and pressure tests. This was about resurrection. A quiet knock on the door pulled him back. It was Elise. "You good?" she asked. "As good as I get. You want someone to introduce you, or?" "No," Frank said. "I've got this." She smiled. "The Lazarus loop is already getting buzz. People are talking. Good or bad? The kind that means it matters." He nodded, and Elise left, the door whispering shut behind her. The lights dimmed in the auditorium. Frank could see the glow of the stage through the crack under the door. When the stage manager called his name, he stood, exhaled, and stepped into the light. The walk to center stage felt longer than it should have. The applause was polite, curious. The audience was a sea of expectant faces, young, sharp, skeptical. And yet, in the second row, he saw them. Carolyn. Jacob. The boys. Jacob gave him a small nod, a signal Frank had once given him before every soccer game. "I'm here. You've got this." Frank stood behind the podium. No notes. No teleprompter. Just a slide, a simple rendering of the Lazarus loop, framed against a lunar landscape. He cleared his throat. "I was supposed to be done. Retired. Finished. Left behind. That's what the world tells you after a certain age. That you've had your turn. That your best ideas are in the past. I believed that. I sat in my garage for 15 years and believed that." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some leaned forward. Others folded their arms. Frank continued. "I worked in life support systems during the shuttle era. Back then, we were building for orbit, not for permanence. When my wife passed, I stepped away. I thought my story was over. But then I saw something Elon Musk said in an interview. He said, if something is important enough, you do it, even if the odds are against you. That stuck with me. Not because I thought I could build a rocket. but because I realized I still had something important inside me. Something unfinished. The screen changed to show the prototype, photos of Frank in the garage, Naomi and Malik beside him, the parts labeled and glowing. So I started small. One system. One idea. One loop. The Lazarus loop. Designed in an Ohio garage. Tested with students. Built from spare parts and stubbornness. It's not glamorous. But it works. And sometimes, what matters most in space isn't speed or spectacle. It's stability. Sustainability. Survivability. He stepped away from the podium, gesturing toward the screen. This system uses passive flow regulation with emergency isolation, adaptable in lunar or Martian gravity, scalable to multi-user habitats. But that's not why I'm here. I'm not here because of the engineering. I'm here because I'm proof that you're never too old to matter. The room was quiet now. Utterly still. We talk about firsts a lot in this industry. First man on the moon. First woman on Mars. But I think we need to talk about nexts. Who's next to build? Who's next to teach? Who's next to pick up the torch and carry it further than we could? The screen faded to black. Just Frank now, alone on stage. We don't just need the young to dream boldly. We need the old to dream again. Because legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you share while you're still here. He paused. Looked out over the audience. Thank you for letting me come back. Then he stepped away. The silence held for a beat, and then erupted. Not polite applause. Not token clapping. A standing ovation. It hit him like G-force. The sound. The sheer wall of it. He saw Jacob rise first, clapping hard, Carolyn next to him with tears in her eyes, the boys cheering like their team had just won the championship. Malik and Naomi were whooping near the tech booth, slapping hands with strangers. Frank stood there, stunned, until the stage manager touched his arm and whispered, "Come on, hero. Let's get you off stage." Backstage, Elise caught him in a hug before he even saw her coming. That, she said, was the kind of story that changes the room. I didn't black out, did I? No. You landed it. He laughed, shaky, and then Jacob was there, pulling him into a hug that was stronger than any word could ever be. Dad, Jacob said, voice thick, you nailed it. You were right, Frank whispered. I wasn't done. That night they celebrated at a quiet place near the river, lights strung overhead, food served in cast-iron skillets, laughter echoing between the trees. The boys took turns mimicking his speech, each trying to outdo the other. Carolyn filmed them all. Malik and Naomi posted clips from the summit online, and by midnight, Frank's inbox was overflowing. Universities. Startups. Mentorship requests. Interview offers. Even a brief note from Elon himself, heard your talk. Well said. Come visit the Starbase anytime. M. Frank stared at that one for a long time, not because of the name, but because of what it symbolized. A full circle. A return trajectory. A second launch. The moon was no longer a place far away. It was inside him. And now, he was ready to go even further. The road to Starbase stretched flat and endless, with the Gulf on one side and nothing but wind-swept land and silence on the other. Frank stared out the rental car window, watching the miles pass like memories, some faded, some sharp, all of them behind him now. Ahead was something else entirely. Boca Chica. South Texas. Starbase. Elon's dream forged into steel and concrete. The very edge of possibility. Frank adjusted the collar of his shirt and glanced at the invitation again. It wasn't formal. It didn't come on SpaceX letterhead. Just a brief email. 6 words. Come visit the Starbase anytime. But it had arrived at just the right moment, 2 weeks after the summit, when the Lazarus Loop was being prepped for further lab integration, when Malik and Naomi had been interviewed on 2 podcasts, and when Jacob had started calling just to say, hey. Everything was shifting, quietly, and Frank had learned enough to recognize momentum when it built under your feet. You didn't argue with gravity. You launched. He passed a "Welcome to Starbase" sign and exhaled slowly. This wasn't NASA. There were no marble lobbies or polished PR campaigns. Here, everything looked temporary and permanent at once: shipping containers turned into labs, scaffolding rising beside rocket shells, security guards in casual polos and high-tech badges. The parking lot looked like a film set, and a scrapyard fell in love and had a genius baby. Frank parked near the visitor gate and stepped out, squinting against the sun. The air smelled like salt, heat, and ambition. A young woman in SpaceX gear greeted him. "Mr. Miller." "That's me. Follow me. You're expected." She led him through a chain-link gate and past towering structures that made Frank's knees feel weak. The super-heavy booster loomed like a building unzipped from Earth. A full Starship sat on its side in a hangar, looking like something from a child's dream that someone had the nerve to actually build. Welders sparked in the shadows. Engineers walked fast, talking faster. There was no ceremony. No one stopping for autographs or press. Everyone was building. That's what hit Frank the hardest: this place was moving. She brought him into a low modular building with huge glass panels and a long conference table at the center. "Have a seat. He'll be in shortly." "He?" She grinned. "You know who." And then she left. Frank sat, his heart pounding like he was 20 again. The door opened 5 minutes later, quiet and casual, and in walked Elon Musk, black t-shirt, black jeans, a look in his eyes like he lived 10 seconds ahead of time. "Frank," he said, offering a hand. "Glad you came. Thanks for the invite. Your work on the Lazarus Loop, it's solid. Creative. And it didn't come from the usual pipeline. That matters more than you think." Frank tried to smile. "I'm not exactly standard issue anymore." Elon shrugged. "Neither am I." He sat down across from Frank, pulled up a tablet, and flipped to a 3D model. "We're planning extended lunar test beds in Nevada and Utah. We'll need a closed-loop system that doesn't fail in cold temps or low-grav simulations. I want your design in the mix." "You're serious." "Always. Especially about redundancy." "You built this with students?" "High schoolers," Frank said. "Bright ones." "Scary bright." "Perfect. That's the model I like: mentorship meets execution. Now, here's the question: you want to consult, or you want to build something bigger?" Frank blinked. "Bigger? You know what Starbase is, Frank. It's not a facility. It's a mindset. No one here asks, what are the odds? They ask, what's the next step? You've done incredible work in your garage. But I think you're just getting started." Frank felt a strange sensation, not pride, not fear, but something deeper. Permission. Not to rest, but to rise. What would building something bigger look like? A mentorship lab. Your name on it. Older engineers guiding younger ones. Applied systems only. No fluff. Build. Break. Iterate. Real time. Real results. I'll fund it if you run it. Frank sat back in his chair. The idea hit him like a rocket stage, loud, sudden, undeniable. "I thought I was done," he said quietly. "Most of us do," Elon replied. "Until we stop thinking about endings and start designing for endurance." He stood. "Take a tour. Walk the site. If you're in, let me know by the end of the week." And just like that, he was gone. No handshake. No speech. Just momentum, moving forward again. Frank stepped outside, the sunlight harsh, the shadows long. He walked past scaffolding, past welders, past launch towers, until he reached a rise in the ground. He climbed it slowly, breath heavy, and at the top he saw it, Starship, upright, silver, monstrous and beautiful. It looked like a bullet made to pierce time itself. A crane lifted something near its midsection. The workers moved like ants on a divine project. And Frank stood there, stunned, struck by the absurd and wonderful truth, he belonged here. Not because he was famous. Not because he was fast. But because he still had fuel. Still had fire. Still had more to give. That night, back at the rented motel, he opened his notebook and wrote just 4 words, say yes. Build forward. He stared at them until they burned into his memory. Then he pulled out his phone and sent one message to Elon's assistant. I'm in. Let's build. He went to sleep that night dreaming not of rockets, but of people, young ones, old ones, all of them gathered under one roof, soldering circuits, swapping ideas, fixing leaks, and pushing further. The future, Frank realized, wasn't waiting for him. It was already calling. And this time, he was picking up. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The first morning at Starbase began like every other day. A sun-baked Texas sky stretched wide and endless, casting long shadows over stacks of raw metal and half-finished rocket parts. But for Frank Miller, it was the start of everything new. Walking through the sprawling complex felt like stepping into a dream built from sweat and stubbornness. The ground vibrated faintly beneath his boots, the heartbeat of rockets being built and tested. It was louder than the doubts that had haunted him for years. The Miller lab was housed in a repurposed shipping container near the heart of the facility. When Frank first saw it, it looked like a storage locker masquerading as a lab. Bare walls, a couple of workbenches, shelves crowded with tools and spare parts, and a whiteboard scrawled with diagrams and schedules. But to Frank, it was a sanctuary, a forge for ideas, a place to build not just systems but hope. His first team assembled around a cluttered table. Malik, Naomi, 2 young engineers fresh out of college named Tara and Luis, and a handful of interns, some barely out of high school, others seasoned engineers craving a second chance. Frank scanned their faces, eager, cautious, some skeptical. They were from everywhere, Texas, California, Michigan, and yet here they were, united by one purpose. To build a closed-loop life support system that could sustain humanity beyond Earth. Good morning, Frank said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. Welcome to the Miller Lab. This isn't a class. It's a challenge. We build. We fail. We learn. And then we build again. Because failure isn't the end. It's the next step. Malik smiled, pulling a notebook from his backpack. Sounds like the summit. Exactly, Frank nodded. That talk wasn't just for show. It was a promise. We're here to deliver on it. Over the next days, the lab buzzed with relentless energy. The team pored over schematics, calibrated sensors, and ran simulations. Tara questioned protocols Frank had used for decades, while Luis brought fresh software tools that automated diagnostics. Malik and Naomi bridged the gap, translating between old-school engineering and new-age tech fluency. Every problem sparked debate. Every delay tested patience. Yet beneath the tension, something else grew, a sense of belonging, of shared mission. One afternoon, as Frank adjusted a valve on a prototype unit, Tara approached him hesitantly. Frank, do you really think this system can work on Mars? The gravity, the dust storms, it's not just Earth in space. Frank wiped sweat from his brow, meeting her gaze. That's the point, Tara. Earth systems don't just need copying. They need reinvention. That's what we're doing here, reinventing life support for the harshest places humans will ever live. Her skepticism softened into determination. I want to be part of that. Then you are. The lab became a crucible where knowledge was exchanged across generations and disciplines. Frank found himself mentoring not just engineering skills, but resilience, the stubborn refusal to quit, the courage to admit mistakes, the audacity to dream when everything seems stacked against you. Yet old ghosts lurked in quiet moments. Some mornings, Frank caught himself staring at the control panel, haunted by the memory of his wife's final breath. Nights when loneliness whispered he was too late, too broken, too far gone. But the lab was a lifeline, a place where purpose chased away despair. One evening, Malik found Frank on the roof of the lab building, gazing at the starship silhouetted against the sunset. "You okay?" Malik asked. "Better than okay. Ready." "You're not just building tech," Malik said softly. "You're building a legacy." Frank smiled, the weight of years lifting a little. "I'm learning to build forward, not backward." A breakthrough came unexpectedly. Naomi, working late on a sensor array, detected an anomaly, a subtle feedback loop in the prototype that could optimize air recycling efficiency beyond their initial calculations. The discovery sent ripples through the team. "This could change everything," Naomi said, eyes bright with excitement. "It's like finding a secret shortcut." Frank gathered everyone. "This is why we build together. Because the best ideas don't come from one mind, they come from many." The lab erupted in energy, pushing harder, iterating faster. Days blurred into nights, the hum of machinery and the clatter of tools a soundtrack to reinvention. Meanwhile, news of the Miller lab spread. SpaceX executives dropped by, impressed by the progress and the spirit. Invitations came for Frank to speak at panels and conferences, his story now woven into the fabric of a new space era. Jacob called regularly, his pride palpable. "Dad, you're a rock star." Carolyn sent photos of the boys visiting the lab, wide-eyed and buzzing with curiosity. The family was healing in ways Frank hadn't dared hope for. But with success came pressure. One afternoon, a SpaceX project manager visited with a list of demands. Deadlines tightened, expectations soared. "This has to work," she said sharply. "No excuses." Frank felt the old familiar weight, the demand to deliver, to perform, to prove himself again. He gathered his team. "Pressure is part of this journey. But so is trust. We don't just build systems, we build each other." The team rallied. The lab became more than a workspace. It was a community, a family of builders defying age, doubt, and limits. And then came the first full-scale test. The Lazarus Loop prototype was installed in a Starship mock habitat. Sensors lined the walls. Monitors tracked oxygen levels, humidity, temperature, and carbon dioxide. The room was tense as systems powered up. Frank stood at the control panel, heart racing. The fans hummed. Air cycled. The loop closed perfectly. The screen displayed stable readings. A cheer erupted. Tears welled in Frank's eyes. This was more than a technical win. It was proof. Proof that reinvention wasn't just a dream. It was happening. That night, the team celebrated under the stars, the starship gleaming behind them like a beacon. Frank looked around at faces glowing with joy and resolve. He thought of Elon's words about endurance and next steps. For the first time in years, he felt not like a man chasing time, but a man shaping it. The Miller lab was no longer just his legacy. It was everyone's future. And Frank Miller was ready to lead it. The humming of machinery in the Miller lab was no longer just background noise, it was the pulse of a fragile dream struggling to stay alive. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of progress and setbacks, a dance between hope and harsh reality. The Lazarus Loop prototype, which had once sparked cheers and celebration, now stood at the center of mounting scrutiny. Early lab tests suggested promising results, but real-world simulations began to reveal cracks beneath the surface, literally and figuratively. The Starship habitat mock-up in Nevada was supposed to be the final proving ground, where the closed-loop system would run in near-lunar conditions for weeks on end. Instead, it revealed unforeseen flaws, minor leaks in the tubing that caused air pressure drops, sensor failures during temperature swings, and a slow but insidious buildup of trace contaminants that threatened to poison the system from within. Frank stared at the data streaming across his tablet, his heart sinking with every red alert. "This can't be happening," Malik muttered, pacing the lab. "We tested for this. We triple-checked everything." "Space doesn't care about triple checks," Frank said grimly. "It cares about reliability." The team gathered around the whiteboard, sketches and flow charts marked up with new ideas, hastily scribbled equations, and desperate notes. Tara furiously tapped on her laptop, running simulations that might pinpoint the source of the leaks. Luis dug into the software algorithms, trying to identify sensor errors. Naomi analyzed environmental factors no one had considered. Every one of them looked exhausted yet fiercely determined. "Failure isn't the enemy," Frank reminded them. "Complacency is." But even Frank's steady voice couldn't mask the weight settling in his chest. His dreams of legacy were now tangled with doubt and the harsh sting of potential defeat. Late nights blurred into early mornings. The lab lights flickered as tired hands swapped out parts and recalibrated sensors. Frank's old bones ached, but he refused to slow down. His thoughts drifted to Carolyn's face, the worry lines etched deeper after every phone call. To Jacob, who'd confided, "Dad, I'm scared you'll burn out." Frank clenched his fists. He owed them more than hope. He owed them results. One particularly grueling afternoon, as Frank wrestled with a stubborn valve that refused to seal, Elise appeared at the lab door. "You should take a break," she said softly. "The team needs you at your best." Frank shook his head. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. If I stop now, we lose everything." Elise crossed the room, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're stronger than you think. But even Elon doesn't do this alone." The reminder felt like a bomb. Frank nodded, allowing himself a moment to breathe. "Thanks." As days turned into weeks, small victories began to emerge from the chaos. Tara identified the source of the leaks, microfractures caused by thermal expansion that hadn't shown up in Earth standard tests. Luis rewrote the sensor calibration software to adapt dynamically to environmental shifts. Naomi devised a new filtration method to capture contaminants before they could spread. Slowly, piece by piece, the Lazarus loop grew more resilient, more precise. The team's spirit hardened too, not brittle, but flexible, like tempered steel forged in fire. They shared stories late into the night, laughter cutting through fatigue, the occasional tears of frustration giving way to smiles of triumph. Frank found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years, letting the young engineers see not just the expert, but the man who had lost so much and found himself again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the lab in hues of gold and shadow, Frank stood with Malik on the roof. Below, the starship gleamed under floodlights, a silent sentinel against the dark. "Do you ever think about quitting?" Malik asked, voice low. Frank looked out at the rocket, then back at Malik. "Every day. But quitting isn't an option. Not when the stakes are this high. Not when so many are counting on us." Malik smiled, nodding. "Good. Because I'm not done yet either." The breakthrough came on a quiet Thursday morning. The full-scale test ran uninterrupted for 72 hours. Oxygen levels remained stable. Carbon dioxide scrubbing operated flawlessly. Pressure held steady. The system had survived the thermal cycles and contaminant challenges. The lab erupted in cheers. Frank felt tears prick his eyes, not just for the win, but for the journey. The team crowded around the monitors, sharing high fives, hugs, and wide grins. "We did it," Naomi said, voice trembling. "No, you did it," Frank corrected gently. "We all did." Word of the successful test spread quickly. SpaceX executives, media, and even NASA representatives visited the lab. Frank found himself speaking on panels and interviews, his voice steady but charged with emotion. He told the story not just of technology, but of endurance, of people who refuse to be defined by age or past failures. "We're not just building for space," he said. "We're building for humanity. For hope. For the next generation of dreamers." At home, Carolyn and Jacob attended a lab open house, marveling at the progress. Jacob pulled Frank aside. "Dad, you inspire me." Frank hugged him tightly. "You inspire me too, kiddo." But beneath the celebration, Frank knew the trials weren't over. Space travel demanded perfection. One flaw could mean disaster. The stakes were sky high, literally. And the next phase would push them further than ever before. Yet for the first time, Frank felt ready. Not because the path was clear, but because he had learned to embrace uncertainty. To find strength in setbacks. To believe in himself and his team, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The Miller Lab was more than a project. It was a testament to what happens when courage meets persistence. When age is not a limit, but a catalyst. And when a man who once thought he was finished finds that his greatest work is still ahead. As Frank looked up at the stars from the roof that night, the constellations seemed less distant, more like guides lighting the way forward. He whispered to the night, "This is just the beginning." The morning light filtered weakly through the dusty windows of the Miller Lab as Frank Miller sipped his black coffee, staring at the screen of his laptop. A barrage of emails filled his inbox, some from eager supporters, many from skeptical journalists, and a few from detractors questioning the feasibility of their work. "Space travel for the elderly," one headline sneered. "A pipe dream dressed up in technology," another jabbed. Frank sighed, closing the laptop and looking out toward the distant starship gleaming in the Texas sun. The burden of expectation was as heavy as ever. His work wasn't just about life support systems anymore, it had become a symbol, a battleground for hopes and fears about aging, relevance, and the future itself. The lab bustled around him, young engineers buzzing with ideas and energy, their voices rising above the hum of machines and tools. They were relentless, undaunted by Frank's age or the enormity of the challenge. "Frank, you've got to see this," Malik called from across the room. Frank rose and followed him to a cluster of screens showing a live stream. It was a panel discussion featuring young space advocates, critics, and a surprising guest, Elon Musk himself, speaking via satellite link from Starbase. "Age is not a limitation," Elon said, his voice clear and resolute. "It's a starting point. Every great innovation in history was born from challenging what was accepted. If you're 60, 70, or 80 and thinking it's too late, you're wrong. You're just getting started." The words hit Frank like a jolt of electricity. The live chat exploded with messages, some supportive, some cynical, but all engaged. "Elon's right," Naomi whispered. "This is bigger than us." The panel wrapped up, but the ripple effect spread far beyond the screen. Frank found himself grappling with the unexpected spotlight, invited to podcasts, interviews, and community talks where he shared not just technical details but stories of reinvention and resilience. One evening, after a long day of troubleshooting the Lazarus Loop, Frank received a message from an unexpected source, a letter handwritten by a woman named Grace, a retired schoolteacher from Ohio. "Dear Mr. Miller," it began. "Your story gave me the courage to take up painting again after 30 years. If you can start something new at your age, maybe I can too." Frank read the letter twice, a lump forming in his throat. These voices from the future, the ripple of change sparked by his work, were the fuel he hadn't known he was missing. Yet the weight of doubt remained, especially when his own family questioned his choices. One afternoon, Carolyn sat down with him, concern etched in her features. "Frank, I'm proud of you. I really am. But sometimes I worry you're pushing too hard. You've given so much already." Frank took her hand, eyes steady. "I'm not doing this for me, Carolyn. I'm doing this so that when people like Jacob look up at the stars, they don't see limits, they see possibilities." She nodded, but the worry lingered. It was a familiar battle, balancing ambition with vulnerability, hope with fear. In the lab, intergenerational tensions surfaced too. Tara, fiercely ambitious, challenged some of Frank's traditional methods. "Respectfully, Frank," she said during a meeting, "sometimes the old ways hold us back. We need to innovate, not just iterate." Frank met her gaze. "And sometimes, the old ways remind us what's been tested through fire. We need both, innovation and experience." The exchange sparked a productive debate, bridging gaps and blending perspectives. It reminded Frank that progress was a conversation, not a monologue. One evening, after the lab had closed, Frank found himself alone on the roof again, gazing at the stars. His phone buzzed, a message from Elon. "Keep pushing. The stars are waiting." Simple words, but like a lifeline thrown across the void. Frank smiled, feeling the familiar fire rekindle in his chest. He wasn't alone. Not now. Not ever. The voices from the future were calling, and he was ready to answer. The air in the Miller lab was thick with anticipation, a charged energy that crackled under fluorescent lights and echoed in the rhythmic clank of tools and soft murmurs of focus. Months of relentless work, countless nights of calculations, and a sea of setbacks had led to this moment. Frank Miller stood at the helm, overseeing the latest iteration of the Lazarus loop. More than just a machine now, it was a symbol of what defying limits truly meant. "All systems ready for the full environmental simulation," Luis announced, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Tara and Naomi double-checked sensors, their eyes sharp despite the fatigue that shadowed them. Frank felt a familiar knot of nerves in his stomach, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the early days of his career. Not fear, but the weight of responsibility. Elon's voice echoed in his mind from a recent interview: "When you hit a wall, break through it. Or go around it. But don't stop." The test began. The habitat simulation mimicked the harsh conditions of Mars: extreme temperatures, fluctuating pressures, and a closed-air system that needed to sustain life without fail. As the hours ticked by, the lab team monitored every parameter: oxygen levels, carbon dioxide scrubbing, humidity, and waste recycling. Data streamed in, numbers rising and falling like waves on a stormy sea. At first, everything held steady. Then, without warning, a sharp drop in oxygen levels triggered alarms. The team froze, eyes darting to the monitors. Frank's heart hammered. "What happened?" he demanded. Luis's face was pale. "Looks like a partial blockage in the scrubber unit. The filters aren't cycling properly." Tara sprang into action, pulling up diagnostics. "We need to bypass the faulty system manually." Frank nodded sharply. "Do it. Now." For the next tense hour, the team worked in near silence, coordinating with precision and urgency. Sweat dripped from Frank's brow as he stayed by the control panel, offering steady directions. Finally, the system stabilized. Oxygen levels normalized. Relief washed over the room like a warm tide. "Good save," Frank said, voice rough but proud. But this shows we're not out of the woods yet. The incident sparked a renewed focus. They redesigned the scrubber unit to be modular, easier to repair remotely or swap out during missions. They fortified filters against dust contamination and created redundant backup systems. Each obstacle became a lesson carved into the lab's DNA. Yet the technical hurdles were only part of the battle. Frank grappled daily with his own internal barriers. His body protested long hours, his mind battled echoes of doubt. There were days when the ghosts of his past crept in, the regrets, the losses, the silent question, is it too late? One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Frank found himself alone in the lab, staring at a faded photo taped inside his toolbox, the family he once had, smiles frozen in time. He traced the edges with a trembling finger. "I'm still here," he whispered. "Still fighting." The lab door creaked open. Tara stepped in quietly. "Mind if I stay a minute?" Frank nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I was just thinking about what you said, that sometimes the old ways hold us back." She smiled softly. "And sometimes, the old ways remind us why we keep going. You taught me that." The two shared a rare moment of understanding across generations, a bridge built from respect and shared struggle. Outside the lab, progress in public perception began to shift too. Articles shifted from skepticism to cautious optimism. Community groups hosted talks about space exploration's new chapter, where age and experience were embraced rather than dismissed. Frank was invited to mentor programs for retirees seeking purpose, becoming a living testament to reinvention. His story, once quiet and private, now inspired a movement, a reminder that barriers were meant to be broken. Then came the day Frank had dreamed of since first stepping foot at Starbase, the first integrated test of the Lazarus loop within a Starship prototype during a prolonged simulation. The lab buzzed with excitement and tension as the system powered up, cycling air, water, and waste with unprecedented efficiency. Hours passed without incident. Sensors hummed in harmony. The habitat environment remained stable. The team watched in awe as the system performed beyond expectations, surpassing every milestone they had set. When the test concluded, a wave of exhilaration swept through the Miller lab. Frank closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the culmination of years of perseverance. This was more than a technological triumph, it was a declaration that limits existed only to be challenged. Elon's words resonated anew: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Frank knew the road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges. But breaking through these barriers had reshaped him, fortified his spirit, renewed his purpose, and lit a fire for the journey forward. As the team celebrated under the stars that night, Frank looked up and whispered, "This is just the beginning." The quiet hum of the Miller lab was punctuated by the rhythmic tapping of keys and soft murmur of voices, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Frank Miller sat in the corner office, the glow of his computer screen casting long shadows on the walls lined with sketches, notes, and faded photographs. He stared blankly at an email from the SpaceX board, an ultimatum wrapped in corporate language: accelerate the project timeline or risk losing critical funding. The words blurred as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The Lazarus Loop was more than a project. It was his second chance, a legacy forged from the ashes of lost dreams and personal reinvention. Yet now, the path forward seemed tangled with impossible demands. Faster, the board said. More efficient. Less margin for error. But Frank knew rushing meant risking mistakes, potentially catastrophic ones. He rubbed his tired eyes, the gravity of responsibility bearing down like a boulder. His mind flickered to Carolyn's face during last night's call, her quiet plea for balance, for him to remember the man beyond the engineer. Jacob's voice echoed too, full of hope and youthful impatience: "Dad, don't let them rush you. What matters is doing it right." Outside, the Texas sky bled into hues of orange and violet as dusk settled. Malik appeared in the doorway, sensing the heaviness in Frank's demeanor. "You look like you're carrying the whole launch pad on your shoulders." Frank managed a tired smile. "Feels that way." Malik pulled up a chair. "We're at a crossroads. But we've faced worse. Remember the scrubber malfunction? The leaks? Each time we found a way forward. This time's no different." The reminder kindled a flicker of resolve. Frank leaned back, eyes drifting to the blueprint of the Starship habitat pinned on the wall. The choice was clear but daunting. Push forward under pressure, risking everything, or stand firm for the integrity of their work and risk losing support. Frank's phone buzzed, a text from Elon Musk. Just 2 words, courage counts. The simplicity struck a chord. Courage, the willingness to face fear, uncertainty, and opposition to do what's right. The word reverberated in Frank's mind as he gathered his team for an emergency meeting. He stood before them, older but unyielding, the lines of experience etched deeply into his face. "We're at a critical junction," he began. "The board wants us to speed up, but we cannot sacrifice safety or quality. I won't ask you to cut corners. We either do this the right way, or not at all." Tara's eyes flashed with fierce agreement. "I'm with you, Frank. We owe it to ourselves and those who'll depend on this system." Luis nodded, voice steady. "We built this on trust in each other and the technology. We can't betray that." The room hummed with renewed purpose, a collective courage rising like a tide. But the cost soon became apparent. Funding was frozen pending a revised timeline, and whispers of leadership changes rippled through SpaceX corridors. Frank's phone rang incessantly, pressure mounting from executives, media inquiries, even old friends urging caution. Carolyn called one evening, her voice thick with emotion. "Frank, promise me you'll take care of yourself. I can't lose you to this." He squeezed her hand through the line. "I'm not done yet. Not until we show the world what's possible." As the days turned to weeks, Frank found himself balancing on a razor's edge. Pushing his body and mind to the limit while rallying his team through uncertainty. Yet, amidst the storm, moments of profound clarity emerged. One afternoon, Jacob visited the lab, eyes wide with curiosity and admiration. "Dad, you're like a space pioneer. I want to be brave like you someday." Frank pulled him close, heart swelling. Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it. The boy's smile was a beacon, a reminder of why the fight mattered. Then came the breakthrough that shifted everything. During a late-night test of the updated Lazarus loop, the system held flawless under stress conditions that would have overwhelmed previous versions. Oxygen remained pure. Carbon dioxide scrubbed efficiently. Temperatures stable. The data streamed in like a symphony of success. The lab erupted quietly, no grand fanfare, just shared smiles and tired nods of satisfaction. Frank felt a surge of pride mingled with relief. It was a victory born of courage. The courage to stand firm, to trust in the process and each other. That night, Frank sat on the roof, gazing at the stars that had always been his compass. His phone buzzed again, another message from Elon: "This is why we push boundaries. You're leading the way." Frank whispered into the dark, "Thank you. For showing me courage isn't just for the young." At the crossroads of challenge and hope, Frank Miller found his path illuminated, not by certainty, but by the unyielding courage to keep moving forward, no matter what lay ahead. The sun rose gently over Boca Chica, painting the horizon with soft strokes of pink and gold, as if nature itself was marking a new beginning. Inside the Miller lab, the atmosphere hummed with quiet energy. Team members gathered around a cluster of screens, eyes reflecting data streams and hopeful anticipation. Frank Miller stood among them, his posture steady, but inside, a current of emotion ran deep. The Lazarus loop wasn't just functioning, it was thriving, surpassing expectations. But beyond the technical triumphs, Frank felt something even more profound taking shape, the echoes of impact that rippled far beyond the confines of the lab. News outlets had picked up their story, broadcasting not just the science but the spirit behind it. Stories poured in, from retirees reclaiming passions long buried, from children inspired to reach for stars, from communities awakened to possibilities they'd thought beyond reach. One morning, Frank held a letter from a woman named Eileen in Ohio. She wrote about how, after watching a documentary on the Lazarus Loop, she enrolled in a computer class at her local library at age 72. "It's like you've given me permission to start again," she wrote. Frank's eyes misted as he read. This was the true measure of their work, transformation igniting transformation. At a community center in San Antonio, Naomi led a workshop for seniors, sharing lessons from their journey. Faces lit with curiosity, doubt melting into wonder. It's never too late to build something new, she told them. Meanwhile, in the quiet suburbs where Frank's daughter Carolyn lived, conversations began to shift. Jacob, once distant and wrapped in his own world, started calling more often, sharing his dreams, asking questions about space, about the future. "Dad, I think I want to study engineering," he said during a video call, his eyes shining with excitement. Frank's heart swelled. The walls that once separated them were crumbling, replaced by bridges of hope and shared purpose. Yet, the echoes were not without their challenges. Some in the community still questioned the practicality of investing in space when problems on Earth seemed so pressing. Frank faced these doubts head-on during a town hall meeting, standing before a crowd of skeptics and supporters alike. "Exploration has always driven progress," he said firmly. "The technologies we develop to survive on Mars will help us solve problems here: clean energy, sustainable living, medical advances. This is not about escape, it's about evolution." The room was silent for a moment before applause broke out, tentative but growing. Change, Frank realized, was a conversation stretching beyond science. It was about belief, about redefining what was possible at any age. Back at the lab, the team celebrated milestones quietly, each small victory a thread in a tapestry woven from determination and heart. Terra's latest prototype for the modular life support system passed rigorous tests, a testament to innovation married with wisdom. Malik and Luis refined data analytics, uncovering efficiencies that brought them closer to their goal. Frank watched them with a mixture of pride and humility. They were not just colleagues, they were a family united by a shared vision. One afternoon, as Frank took a rare walk along the beach, the salty breeze carried memories of youth spent dreaming beneath the same stars, of losses that had once felt insurmountable. He paused, looking out at the endless blue expanse, feeling a profound sense of peace. He was no longer the man defined by regrets or faded hopes. He was a beacon. Proof that transformation was always within reach. His phone buzzed with a call from Carolyn. "Dad, I'm coming to visit. We need to talk." When she arrived, the warmth between them was palpable. They shared stories, laughter, and tears, the healing balm of reconnection. Jacob joined them too, eager and curious. Over coffee, they dreamed aloud of futures bright with possibility. That night, Frank stood on the porch of his modest home, gazing at the stars with renewed wonder. Elon Musk's words echoed in his mind: "If something's important enough, you do it even if the odds are against you." The odds had never mattered. What mattered was the courage to begin, to persist, and to believe in the ripple of impact each action could create. Frank whispered into the night, "This is just the start of something greater." The echoes of their journey would carry far, across generations, communities, and the infinite expanse of the universe itself. And Frank Miller, once feeling lost in the tides of time, had become a guiding light for those ready to embrace change, no matter their age. The early morning sky over Boca Chica was a canvas of muted blues and soft grays, the kind of light that promises a new day but holds its breath, waiting. Inside the Miller lab, the hum of machines mingled with quiet conversations, a symphony of purpose and hope. Frank Miller stood near the large window, watching as the Starship prototype gleamed in the distance, its steel surface catching the first tentative rays of sunlight. This moment wasn't just about technology, it was about people, about unity, resilience, and the power of rising together. The Lazarus Loop had brought them this far, but it was the team, a blend of experience and youthful ambition, that truly breathed life into the project. Tara, Luis, Malik, and Naomi moved with focused energy, their faces etched with determination. Frank had learned that success wasn't a solo journey, it was a chorus, each voice vital, each note building towards something greater. Yet, as the project progressed, challenges emerged that tested more than technical skill. Funding uncertainties returned, political pressures mounted, and whispers of skepticism from outside circles threatened to undermine morale. One afternoon, as the team gathered for their weekly meeting, tension rippled through the room. "We can't keep spinning our wheels," an investor's email read, "we need results, and we need them now." Tara slammed her laptop shut, frustration flashing in her eyes. "They don't see the hours we put in, the risks we're managing." Malik nodded grimly. "It feels like we're being asked to sprint a marathon." Frank raised his hand, commanding attention. "We're on the front lines of something unprecedented. That means patience, grit, and faith, not just from us, but from everyone who believes in this mission." His voice carried the weight of years lived, of battles fought and won. "We rise together or not at all." The team absorbed his words, a collective breath steadying them. Outside the lab, a new opportunity sparked hope. SpaceX announced a community outreach program to engage local schools and organizations, inviting Frank's team to lead workshops and talks. It was a chance to inspire the next generation and remind their own team why the work mattered. Naomi spearheaded the effort, organizing events where children and seniors alike could explore space science hands-on. The laughter of children mixing with the wise questions of elders created a bridge across generations, a living testament to the inclusive spirit Frank championed. During one workshop, a young girl named Emily approached Frank with wide eyes. "Do you think I could really go to Mars someday?" she asked, clutching a model rocket. Frank knelt down, meeting her gaze. "If you believe it and work hard, nothing can stop you." Her smile was a spark that ignited something inside him, a reminder of the dreams he once held and the legacy he now helped build. Back in the lab, the team celebrated another breakthrough, a new prototype of the life support system that was lighter, more efficient, and easier to maintain. Tara's innovation blended cutting-edge technology with the lessons Frank's experience had taught them, a perfect marriage of old and new. As they tested the system under simulated Martian conditions, sensors confirmed stability, endurance, and adaptability. The room erupted quietly in cheers and hugs. That evening, Frank stood outside, the warm breeze carrying the scent of the sea. Carolyn joined him, her presence a soothing balm. "You've built more than a machine," she said softly. "You've built a family." Frank smiled, eyes crinkling at the edges. "And together, we're ready for whatever comes next." The days that followed were marked by collaboration on a larger scale. Frank was invited to speak at conferences and forums, sharing not just technical insights but the story of their journey, the courage, the setbacks, the unwavering belief in possibility. His message resonated, sparking partnerships and attracting fresh talent eager to join the mission. Elon Musk's influence was felt throughout, the relentless push to defy convention, to innovate without fear. Yet Frank never forgot the human heart beneath the technology. One night, alone in the lab, he received a video call from Elon. The satellite link crackled briefly before the familiar face filled the screen. "Frank," Elon began, "you and your team are rewriting the playbook on what's possible, not just for space, but for life itself. Keep leading with courage." The words were a bomb and a challenge, fueling Frank's resolve. He looked around at the equipment, the notes, the faces of his team flashing in his mind. They were rising together, each of them a thread in the fabric of a new future. In that moment, Frank understood something profound: transformation wasn't a destination, but a journey walked side by side. And no matter the obstacles, no matter the doubts, they would keep rising, together. The night sky stretched endlessly above Boca Chica, a vast ocean of stars whispering secrets of worlds yet to be discovered. Frank Miller stood at the edge of the launch pad, the cold metal beneath his boots grounding him even as his mind soared beyond earthly bounds. The starship gleamed in the moonlight, a silver arrow poised to pierce the veil of the atmosphere and carry humanity's dreams further than ever before. Tonight was more than a test, it was a testament to years of grit, sacrifice, and unwavering belief that the impossible could become reality. As the countdown began, Frank's thoughts drifted back through the winding paths that had led him here, regrets and triumphs, losses and new beginnings woven together like constellations forming a new map. He thought of his youth, those restless days when the stars seemed both distant and tantalizingly close, and how age had threatened to dim that fire within him. But here he was now, standing on the brink of something greater than any one man, a bridge between generations and worlds. Around him, the team moved with quiet precision, their faces illuminated by the glow of monitors and the flicker of anticipation. Tara's eyes met his briefly, a shared heartbeat of determination and hope. Malik double-checked systems, while Luis monitored telemetry with calm focus. Each person carried a story of courage and resilience, and Frank felt honored to walk this path with them. The intercom crackled, T-10 seconds and counting. The air thickened with tension and possibility. Frank closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a breath that carried the salt tang of the nearby sea. "This is for all of us," he whispered to the night. The engines ignited, a deep rumble vibrating through the ground and rising into the sky like a roar from the future. Starship lifted slowly at first, then surged upward, slicing through clouds with grace and power. Cheers erupted around Frank, but he remained still, eyes locked on the vessel climbing toward the stars. As the rocket ascended, so did Frank's thoughts. What lay beyond that horizon? Mars was the first step, a new world to explore and understand, but the journey did not end there. Humanity's destiny, he believed, was to become a multiplanetary species, to carry the torch of curiosity and survival to the farthest reaches of space. Yet with vision came responsibility. The challenges were immense, not just technical but ethical and emotional. How would they protect this new world? How would they ensure that mistakes of the past were not repeated? Frank's heart ached with the knowledge that their mission was also a test of humanity's capacity to evolve, to grow wiser with age and experience. Back at the lab, the team monitored every detail, eyes reflecting the unfolding history. Data streamed in, systems performing flawlessly, trajectory perfect. The mission was a success. Later that night, Frank sat alone on a bench overlooking the launch site, the adrenaline fading to a quiet glow of accomplishment. His phone buzzed, a message from Elon Musk: "One small step tonight, one giant leap for all of us. Keep looking beyond." The words felt like a benediction, a call to keep dreaming and pushing forward. As dawn broke, Frank's daughter Carolyn joined him, her presence a steady anchor in the shifting tides of his journey. "You're becoming a part of something timeless," she said softly. "Your work will inspire generations." Frank smiled, feeling the weight and warmth of legacy. "It's more than that," he replied. "It's a promise, that age, time, or doubt don't define us. What matters is what we choose to do next." Together, they watched the sunrise, a new day unfolding like the infinite possibilities waiting just beyond the horizon. The journey was far from over, but Frank Miller was ready to face it, not alone, but rising together with those who dared to dream beyond limits. The hum of the shuttle's engines was a steady heartbeat beneath Frank Miller's thoughts as the vast expanse of space slipped away behind them, replaced gradually by the familiar curve of Earth growing larger in the viewport. After months of trials, breakthroughs, and moments that tested every ounce of resolve, the Lazarus Loop mission was nearing its end, but the journey felt far from over. Frank sat quietly in the cabin, the weight of years etched into his posture, the flicker of emotions beneath his calm exterior impossible to hide. Space had changed him, expanded his view of life's fragility and strength, of humanity's smallness and greatness in the same breath. Yet, returning home brought its own challenges. The stars had whispered promises of new beginnings, but Earth was where his heart still ached the most. Carolyn's face, the warmth of family dinners, the hum of everyday life, all awaited him, but so did the ghosts of old wounds. He thought of the years spent chasing distant dreams, the moments missed, the rifts formed with those he loved most. Could he bridge the gap? Could he reconcile the man he'd become with the man they remembered? The shuttle's descent was smooth but symbolic, a reminder that endings and beginnings often intertwined like the delicate dance of dawn and dusk. As the spacecraft touched down and the hatch hissed open, Frank stepped into the embrace of gravity and familiarity. Cameras flashed, voices called his name, but his gaze sought only one face in the crowd. Carolyn's eyes glistened with tears as she ran to him, enveloping him in a hug that spoke of forgiveness, hope, and renewed connection. Jacob stood nearby, shy but proud, the distance of years shrinking in an instant. In the days that followed, Frank navigated the delicate terrain of reintegration, media interviews, public appearances, and quiet moments of reflection. The applause was thunderous, but what moved him most were the private conversations, neighbors sharing stories of how his journey had sparked their own transformations, old friends reaching out, bridges once burned beginning to mend. Yet, the road home was not without struggle. At times, memories of loss and regret surfaced with a sharp edge, threatening to pull him into shadows. But each time, he found strength in the lessons space had taught him, the power of resilience, the courage to face the unknown, and the unbreakable bond of family and community. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Frank sat on his porch with Carolyn and Jacob. The sky above was a tapestry of stars, a silent witness to their healing. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Jacob said softly, his voice steady. "Not just for what you did out there, but for coming back." Frank smiled, the ache in his chest easing. "I was never truly gone. I just needed to find my way back." In the quiet moments between conversations, Frank reflected on the journey, not just the physical voyage beyond the stars, but the inner odyssey of transformation. He realized that home was not merely a place but a state of being. A space where courage, love, and hope converged. The long road home had been winding and hard, but it had brought him full circle to a new beginning. And as he looked toward the future, Frank Miller knew that the true journey was just beginning, with family by his side in a world waiting to be inspired by those who dare to dream beyond limits. The early morning light spilled gently through the curtains of Frank Miller's modest home, casting long shadows that danced like memories across the wooden floor. Outside, the world was waking, birds calling softly, a breeze stirring the leaves, and the distant hum of life carrying on in its relentless march. But inside, Frank faced a quieter, more profound journey, the final frontier within himself. Years of struggle, of feeling invisible and irrelevant, had etched deep lines not just on his face but within his soul. The journey to space had been a triumph, a victory against time and doubt, but now came the most daunting challenge. Facing the fears and regrets that lingered beneath the surface. He sat in his favorite chair, worn but comforting, clutching an old photograph, the family gathered around a table long ago, smiles bright but fragile. The ghosts of lost chances and strained relationships whispered in the corners of his mind. Was he truly free? Could he let go of the weight that had held him captive for decades? The answer did not come easily. For years, Frank had battled the notion that age meant limitation, that the best days were behind him. But Elon Musk's words, reverberating in his memory, challenged that belief: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are against you. That fire had propelled him beyond the stars, but now it had to fuel his reckoning with self. He began journaling, pouring raw thoughts onto paper, regrets, hopes, fears, and dreams tangled in a messy dance. Each word was a step toward healing, a crack in the fortress of silence he had built around his heart. Slowly, Frank reached out, to Carolyn, to Jacob, to old friends long left in the background. Conversations unfolded with a mixture of hesitation and hope, each one a thread weaving a tapestry of reconciliation and understanding. The process was neither swift nor easy. There were moments of doubt, of pain resurfacing like storm waves threatening to drown progress. But with each challenge, Frank discovered reservoirs of resilience he had never known. One afternoon, walking along the beach with Carolyn, he shared his fears openly. "I thought space was the hardest frontier," he said, voice low, "but it's this, facing myself, that's truly the final journey." Carolyn squeezed his hand gently. "You're not alone, Dad. We're all walking our own frontiers." That night, Frank sat beneath the vast canopy of stars, feeling small yet connected, part of something infinite and timeless. The cosmos stretched before him, a mirror to the endless possibilities within. He understood now that transformation was not a destination but a continuous unfolding, a choice to rise despite fear and uncertainty. He whispered a promise to himself, to live fully, to love openly, to embrace every moment as a gift. The final frontier within was not a barrier but a doorway, a threshold into a life renewed, rich with purpose and peace. And as dawn broke over Boca Chica, Frank Miller felt a profound truth settle in his heart: he was never too old to change, never too late to begin again. The journey inward was the greatest adventure of all. The sun hung low over Boca Chica, bathing the coastline in golden light that shimmered like liquid hope. Frank Miller stood once again near the launch pad, but this time the roar of rockets was joined by the gentle murmur of a community transformed. The Starship prototype stood tall, a symbol of human ingenuity and daring, but more importantly, a beacon for what one life, no matter the age, could inspire. The journey that had begun in quiet doubt and shadowed regret had blossomed into a new legacy, one not measured in accolades or fame, but in hearts touched and futures ignited. Frank looked around at the faces gathered, young and old, familiar and new, each carrying stories of their own struggles and triumphs. Carolyn was there, her smile radiant with pride. Jacob, now a confident young man, stood nearby, a living testament to healing and hope. Tara, Malik, Luis, and Naomi mingled with local families, sharing laughter and dreams under the vast sky. The community had rallied, inspired by a mission that transcended technology, a mission to prove that age was not an end, but a beginning. Frank's thoughts drifted to Elon Musk, the visionary whose spark had ignited so many fires. Elon's relentless drive, fearless rebellion against limitations, and refusal to accept too late had been a guiding light. Yet Frank understood that the true power lay in the courage to take that spark and kindle it into a blaze of personal transformation. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Frank took a deep breath and stepped to the podium erected for the evening's gathering. The crowd hushed, anticipation palpable. "When I first began this journey," Frank began, voice steady but filled with emotion, "I was haunted by the belief that my best days were behind me, that time had stolen my purpose. But through challenges, through failures and breakthroughs, I discovered a profound truth: we are never too old to change, to grow, to make a difference." Applause rippled through the crowd, but Frank's eyes sought those who needed this message most, the older faces marked by doubt, the younger eyes searching for inspiration. Elon Musk once said, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are against you." That's what this mission has taught me. It's not about the rockets or the technology. It's about the human spirit, the refusal to be defined by age, fear, or failure. The air was thick with hope as Frank's words settled in. This new legacy is ours to write. It's a story of rising together, of embracing the unknown, and of believing in the impossible. After the speech, Frank wandered among the crowd, sharing stories and smiles, feeling the electric pulse of connection. He noticed a young woman approaching, eyes bright with curiosity. "Mr. Miller," she said, "your journey has inspired me to chase my own dreams, no matter the doubts." Frank smiled warmly. "That's all I ever hoped for, to spark that fire in others." Later, as night wrapped the sky in a velvet embrace, Frank sat quietly by the shoreline with Carolyn. The gentle crash of waves was a soothing rhythm, a reminder of life's endless flow. "You've given us all permission to matter again," Carolyn said softly. Frank nodded, the weight of years lifting. "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission, to believe that my story wasn't finished." The stars above twinkled like promises, and Frank felt a deep peace settle within. The mission to Mars was just one chapter in a much larger story, the story of a man who refused to fade, who chose to rise and, in doing so, helped others find their own light. The new legacy was clear: age was not a limit but a lens through which to see possibility. It was the courage to begin again, the strength to embrace change, and the power of community to transform lives. And as the first stars of night appeared, Frank Miller knew that the greatest journey was not to another planet, but to a renewed self, one filled with purpose, hope, and boundless horizons. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?